Hey, look who decided to finally wake up, I said. I'm alive? Eddie replied. No, heaven consists of you lying in a hospital with me sitting next to you, I said. Are you okay? He asked. Who the hell was that shot me? I'll explain all of that to you soon, I promise. We just need to get you better. So what made you decide to take a bullet for me? I asked. It's complicated, he replied. I know, Eddie, I said. You know what? He asked. The look on my face told him everything. So, I said, how long did it take for you to figure everything out? I basically knew as soon as I saw you, he replied. Trying to quickly change the subject, Eddie said, I'm in a lot of pain. Can you go find me my nurse? As I was walking out of the room, Eddie stopped me. Mark, just so you know, I would have taken the bullet anyway. Just don't expect me to call you Dad, Eddie. I walked around and eventually found the nurse who had Eddie as her patient. While back in the room, Eddie asked me, So, did they catch the guy that shot me? John, you mean, I said. His name is John, and he's currently on the run still. I'm sure they'll catch him soon. Anyway, if you knew as soon as you saw me, why didn't you tell me? It's complicated, he replied. As soon as I was sent away, your mom eventually cut all contact off with me. I can't blame her. She even cut off my entire family, even your grandmother. That's why she never visited you in there. She knew nothing about you or where you were at. Well, I said, we just need to focus on getting you better and getting you out of here. I have to go to work, but I'll stop back in later. Work that night went by slower than ever and was pure torture. It was like I couldn't get Haley, Eddie, and John out of my mind. The police must have gotten so annoyed with me calling so often to see if they had caught John yet, or calling to ask what was taking them so long. You would think a man that killed an innocent girl and was an attempted murder suspect that was obviously armed would be a high priority. Once my shift at work finally came to an end, I went back to the hospital to check on Eddie. Although his condition was getting better and better, mentally he seemed in a bad place. Even worse, I had to be the bearer of bad news and let him know that they were still looking for John. I stayed with Eddie a bit and we talked. He told me he was sad that being stuck in the hospital was better than being at his halfway house, and how awful it was there. I told him I believe in him and he could get through it. He was tired, so I told him I was leaving and would come see him the next day before work. The next day I found myself lying to Eddie, telling him I had some errands to run before work and would stop by after work. The real reason I couldn't visit him before work was because I had to do some things behind Eddie's back. I started with the house manager at Eddie's halfway house and was referred to Eddie's caseworker. I explained to the caseworker that Eddie was my biological father and that I was left a big house all to myself after my mother had passed away, and that I felt it would be better for both myself and Eddie if he stayed with me after being released from the hospital. The caseworker didn't seem opposed to this, but told me it wasn't up to him, and that I would have to get an order from a judge. Luckily, the following day, there was a walk-in day scheduled at court. Although this was mostly for people that missed their court dates and things of that nature, I felt like it was at least a chance to get myself in front of a judge. I did end up in front of a judge the following day, but the judge said he didn't handle matters related to what I came in for. After being bounced around from person to person at the courthouse, I was finally able to schedule a court date with a magistrate the following Monday. I had several days to go before I would even have the opportunity to get this set up for Eddie, and I wasn't even sure how he was going to reply. We lived together for a long time and always enjoyed each other's company, but things were different now. Now that he knows that I know, he might look at things differently. Even if I'm able to get a magistrate to approve all of this, I still don't know what the result will be. And what if Eddie is released before my court date? I needed to calm myself down before I had a full-blown panic attack. I decided I would just take things as they come. I wasn't going to mention any of this to Eddie until after I see the magistrate. If by chance the idea excites him, I don't want to let him down if the magistrate declines my request. Over the next few days, I was doing nothing but constantly trying to juggle my life, going to work, visiting Eddie, looking into what's happened with John, and most of all, trying to keep my emotions in check. This life I'm living is still all so new to me. I've found love and lost it. I've lost my mom, and found out my best friend was my father after he took a bullet for me. There's a man out there with a gun who wants me dead, and the police still haven't been able to find him. Seriously, if I wasn't already crazy, all of this would get me there. When I went to visit Eddie Sunday evening, I found out that he was expected to be released from the hospital by Tuesday or Wednesday. This gave me a great sense of relief. Not only did it mean that Eddie was recovering well, but it gave me the opportunity to go to court prior to Eddie getting released. This night, Eddie finally demanded that I explain everything to him, and I did. He already knew a lot of the background information of what got me put into the institution to begin with, but none of the specifics of how and why it was boiling over into my, and now his, current life. I ended up talking about things a lot longer than I had hoped. Eddie was sent away when I was a baby and had no clue what my life was like up until then. He only knew my first name, but could still sense who I was when he met me. Everything in between, he was never given information to. I told him about my childhood, things that happened at school, how I suffered with my condition gradually getting worse, and the night that changed my life, and now the backlash from it that was happening as we spoke. The entire time I was speaking, Eddie looked like he wanted to tell me something, but all he did was ask me about my brother. Eddie had no contact with my older brother, and hadn't since he was just a few years old. Hell, I only had rather rare contact with him anymore myself. Between losing his dad, losing his mom, and even losing his brother for the most part, no one can blame him for moving away to start a new life. Eddie and I really began bonding in a new way from this point. Not so much in a father-son type way, but just a way that was different. I tried steering the conversation in a new direction at this point, and asked Eddie if he could tell me more about himself, specifically what his life was like when he was younger, and what got him sent away. The most I could get out of him were pretty vague statements. He again just told me he had made bad decisions, and that he was looked at as a danger to himself and those around him. But to be locked up for so many years, there has to be something more in particular, I said. Well, Mark, he replied, things aren't the way they are today. If you were looked at as being a crazy person a couple decades ago, the easiest solution was to just lock you up and throw away the key. Psychology and medication has really come a long way since then. I knew Eddie was right, and I began feeling both grateful and guilty at the same time. It was really late at this point, so I decided to say my goodbyes and head home. Monday morning came quick. I woke up before my alarm, and with an extreme sense of anxiety, scrambled to find my phone to make sure that I hadn't slept in. Luckily, I had only woken up early, not late. Between going to court and having John out on the loose, I wasn't getting the best sleep as it was. But I had to meet my own counselor before going to court, so waking up early was a relief when compared to sleeping in past my alarm. My own appointment was business as usual, and I raced over to the courthouse as soon as I could. Upon arriving, I navigated my way around the building until I was finally directed to the proper courtroom. Having to now finally just sit and wait, I began to grow more and more nervous. I started overthinking the entire situation. Even if things did go the way I wanted today, would Eddie actually want to move in? Would he be offended I did this behind his back? Would we still get along if we lived together outside of a controlled environment? I tried to erase all these thoughts from my mind and instead go over in my head what I wanted to say to the magistrate. I just needed to focus on doing what I think is best, and the rest will take care of itself, right? I looked around at how many other people were seated in the courtroom and started to realize just how long I might be sitting here in paranoia about what may or may not happen. To my relief, I was only the third person called to see the magistrate. I was asked to present the purpose why I was there. After giving the most compelling reasons I could as to why Eddie should be allowed to stay with me, and tell him how well we both have been doing for so long, the magistrate then read over something he had for several seconds, and simply granted my request. All of that preparation, fear, and anxiety that led up to this point was trumped in less than a minute by the magistrate quickly and easily giving me what I asked for. At this point, any fear I had of how Eddie might react vanished and was quickly replaced with relief and excitement. As soon as I obtained the paperwork I needed from the clerk, I left the courthouse and raced over to see Eddie. Once I got to Eddie's floor at the hospital, I started picturing myself walking into his room, only to find it empty. This morbid thought was gone as quickly as it started when I walked into his room, to find him sitting up in bed watching TV. "Hey Mark," he said. "Good news. The doctor was just in and told me I'm clear to go home tomorrow morning." "That's great, Eddie," I said. I actually want to talk to you about that." Eddie's expression changed to concern when he noticed the apprehension in my voice. "Eddie, I just got back from court. It wasn't for anything bad, and I hope this doesn't upset you or offend you." "Mark, just get to the point," he said. "Okay, I got an order that says you could come stay with me. I have this big house and I'm there alone. Plus I know you hate the halfway house. It's just an idea. You can do whatever you want." There was silence for a couple of moments. Eddie finally replied, "Are you serious?" "Yeah, but like I said, it's just an idea. You can't..." He cut me off again. "Mark, that's amazing. You're not just messing with me?" I was glad to be getting better, but I dreaded going back to that halfway house. "Yes, Eddie," I said. "I'm serious. I'm not messing with you. Tomorrow when you are discharged here, you can just leave with me and come back to stay at my house. We can go get the rest of your stuff from the halfway house whenever you feel up to it." Eddie, using more strength than he probably should have, grabbed my arm and pulled me in for a hug. "Thank you, Mark," he said. "You're welcome. It'll be good for both of us. Now, let's not rip your stitches out over it, though. I have to go to work soon. I'll be back tomorrow morning to come pick you up." I went home to relax for a bit and recover from everything that went on today. After a while, I headed into work. It went by much quicker this night, now that I wasn't consumed with the thoughts of what could go wrong. I was still worried about John being out there, but felt somewhat safe, due to doubting he would come back to this part of town to chase after me. He was being looked for by the police, and although he was able to hide up until this point, if he showed his face around the areas I frequented, he would be arrested shortly after. The next morning, I made sure to allow myself enough time to get to the hospital early so Eddie wouldn't have to wait around in the lobby for me. He said he felt well enough to go get the rest of his belongings from the halfway house, so we stopped there on our way home. Eddie was pretty surprised at how big the house was that was left for me, and understood a little better why I didn't want to be there by myself. By the time we got Eddie's belongings inside, he needed to rest. While he laid in bed, I set up his room around him as he directed me into where to put what. It was comical at times, and once I was done, I felt like resting myself. For the next few days, things went great. Eddie mostly lounged around at home as he was still recovering from his wound, and I was more than happy to help him out in any way I could. He would occasionally mention how he felt bad that I was paying his way, but I continually reassured him that between my job, what my mom left for me, and the fact that he saved my life, I was more than happy with the arrangement. "You can get a job when you're feeling all the way better," I said. "Don't rush into it before you're ready, and take your time and find something you'll enjoy doing. It's been years since you've worked, so don't get overwhelmed." Eddie seemed satisfied with my reassurance and eventually stopped reminding me of the guilt he felt within our current situation. Our living situation was great overall, and Eddie and I continued building our relationship with one another and got along great. Things seemed so perfect that at times I would feel for the small lump in my arm just to make sure my medication was current and I wasn't imagining all of this. I had gone through so much turmoil in the small amount of time I'd been living back in normal society that it was difficult for me to process how things could be going so well. And then it happened. I didn't know it at first, but soon enough, I was back to being under attack. It started one day when Eddie and I were going to the store. While driving, I noticed that my brakes were feeling weird. The brake pedal would push down close to the floor, but I assumed I just needed a brake job, and it wasn't too noticeable, just gently stopping before pulling out of my driveway. As I arrived to the first stop sign on our commute, I had to actually press down on the brakes while going at a much faster pace. That's when I found out just how bad my brakes were. As I approached the intersection, I began to brake, but as I pressed down, I heard a popping sound. My foot went to the floor, and I quickly realized I had no brakes at all. In a complete panic, I told Eddie to hold on, and prayed no one would be coming through the intersection at the same time as us. But I wasn't so lucky. A car passed through right in front of us. I had no way to stop, and they were right in my path. Out of desperation, I cut the wheel to the right, running us off the road and into a small ditch. Luckily, we were only going about 30 miles per hour while approaching the intersection, but the impact was still pretty jarring. Once we came to the abrupt stop, I immediately directed my attention to Eddie. "Eddie, oh my God, are you okay? Is your wound okay?" I'm so sorry." "I'm okay," he replied. "What the hell just happened?" "I'm not sure. My brakes felt a bit weird pulling out of the driveway, and when I went to stop just now, it's like they just completely went out. I couldn't slow down at all." With neither of us being very hurt, we eventually calmed down and decided we would figure out how to handle this situation. Luckily, the AAA package my mom had purchased was still active, and I was on the account. After waiting for a while, a tow truck showed up and gave us a ride to the shop he brought my car to. This is when things went from feeling unlucky to feeling terrified. Eddie and I sat waiting as the mechanic lifted my car up and began to inspect the brakes. We watched as the mechanic called another man over to look at my car, and shortly after he came over to me. He had a very concerned look on his face as he told me, "Well, I can tell you what's wrong with your car, and I'll be able to fix it, but unfortunately, it appears as if someone deliberately cut your brake line. You might want to contact the authorities about this." Eddie and I sat there stunned as we took in the information we were being told. We looked at each other, and I immediately said, "John." "Do you really think so?" Eddie replied. "Hasn't he been in hiding somewhere?" "Well, yeah, Eddie, he has, but who else would do this? There's literally no one else I could think of that would try something like this. And it isn't the first attempt he has made on my life. Not to mention, he's already killed before. Part of me expected him to disappear forever, or at least until he was caught. But now I think he's trying to finish the job." Eddie and I sat in silence for a bit, both trying to wrap our heads around what was really going on. After my brakes were repaired, we headed over to the police station to make a report. I had hope that presenting the officer with something that had just happened earlier in the same day would spark a localized manhunt. Unfortunately, the officer just took down my information and thanked me. I pressed him on how serious this was and that I still felt like I was in danger. He assured me that they and other agencies were working hard on the case, but I still left the police station feeling much less hopeful than when I arrived. The officer also told me they would have a patrol car come down my street every so often to make sure everything appeared to be in order at my house. Eddie and I pulled into our driveway that evening once we finally made it home. "So, now what do we do?" I asked. "About what?" he replied. "About John," I continued. "The police obviously aren't doing enough. He's wanted for both murder and attempted murder, yet he's able to come back into town to try to attack me again? We need our own plan or form of protection." "Protection," Eddie laughed. "What exactly do you think the gun store would say when looking into either of our backgrounds?" "I don't mean a gun," I said, a bit annoyed at this point. "There are other options, even pepper spray or a bat or a knife. Anything would be better than nothing." "Look, Mark," Eddie replied, "we don't need to panic. The police are on top of this. We just aren't following them around and watching them work, so it seems like they're doing nothing. Also, we don't know for a fact that it's John behind this. It could have even just been a prank by some kids around here." I lost my cool at this point and snapped at Eddie. "First of all, don't do the whole 'look, Mark' thing to me, like you're my dad all of a sudden. And you can stay in your little world of delusion, but not all of us have been locked up in an institution the majority of our lives. There are real-world issues that you have to deal with out here." I could see the hurt on Eddie's face, and I regretted everything I said to him as the words were coming out. I got out of the car and began to walk inside. At this point, I wasn't mad at him, and I felt guilty for what I had said, but I didn't have the courage to face him and apologize. I stayed locked in my room that night and tried to forget about everything. How could I say something like that to Eddie? He literally took a bullet for me, and it wasn't his choice to stay out of my life all those years. I wanted to go talk to him, but instead, I lied in bed and eventually drifted off to sleep. Upon awakening the next morning, the thoughts of what had happened the day before came flooding back. I timidly walked downstairs after using the restroom to find Eddie at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and just staring out of the window. "Hey, Eddie, look," he cut me off. "No, Mark, it's okay, you're right." "I wasn't right," I replied. "I was frustrated and angry and scared. I still am. I took it out on you, and that isn't fair. I'm really sorry." "Mark," he said, "I've thought more about what you said, and I think you're right. It's easier to deny that our lives are in danger, rather than worry about it and prepare. But if this really is John coming after you, we need to do something. I pray that the police will get to him first, but if he shows up here, we need to have a plan B." It was at that moment that I began to feel a little relief. I was still fearful of the overall situation, but at least I didn't have to face it alone. I sat down next to Eddie, and we began talking about all the actual practical ways we could face this potential situation. We decided first and foremost that we needed to safeguard the house better. We bought better locks for the doors and windows, and even alarms that would beep when a window was open. We figured if he did end up showing up here, the best case scenario would be making it as hard as possible to get in. As we already had discussed, neither of us were eligible to purchase a firearm, but we did manage to come up with pepper spray, a hunting knife, and a small taser. Once we had all of this finished, we did feel a bit better. A small part of me was hoping that John really was after me, or else I'd end up feeling pretty silly for doing all of this. But the larger part of me was hoping I would never see John again, at least not outside of a courtroom. A few days went by, and I began wondering if it was just my paranoia getting to me after all. But one night after work, any doubt I had vanished. Eddie was already in bed at this point. I had just gotten out of the shower and ready for bed myself. Lying in bed, I was mindlessly looking at things on my phone when I began to hear a clicking noise coming from somewhere. I couldn't identify what it was. I sat up in bed and remained completely silent as I tried to figure out exactly what I was hearing. My heart began racing. I dialed 911 on my phone, just so I had it ready to go in case I needed it. I slowly and quietly crept out of bed and inched my way towards the source of the noise with my phone still in my hand. I quickly remembered the other items I had purchased for self-defense and cursed myself for leaving them down in the kitchen. I got to the top of the stairs and was able to tell the clicking noise was coming from downstairs. Stepping on the very side of the stairs to limit any noise I made, I crept down step by step, basically holding my breath at this point. Before I could even make it quite halfway down the stairs, the silence was violently interrupted by the piercing sound of one of the window sensor alarms going off. I froze in place at the realization that the noise I was hearing was actually the result of another person. In a matter of maybe 2 seconds, the noise suddenly stopped, indicating that the window had been shut. I could hear obvious footsteps retreating from my property. This gave me a sense of relief, and I ran down the rest of the stairs to the window the noise had been coming from. Just seconds later, I heard Eddie coming down the hall from his room and heading down the stairs himself. It was dark outside of my property, and I found myself wishing I had installed motion detection floodlights, but even without them, I could see him moving quickly away from my property. There was no doubt in my mind that it was John, and he clearly hadn't given up the idea of ending my life. Luckily, the window alarm seemed to save us this time. Eddie was full of questions as to what just happened, and I filled him in on everything as I hit send on my phone to contact the police. Eddie was visibly shaken over this, which was the first time I had seen him show this kind of emotion since moving in. I knew he had believed me, at least to an extent, but I could tell it just got real for him. After explaining what just happened to the dispatcher, an officer came out to my house about 10 minutes later. He looked at the window and explored around other areas of my property, but despite what I told him, he said there was no indication that the lock on the window had been tampered with. I didn't see how this was possible, but didn't think it mattered anyway. I literally saw with my own eyes what happened and who was responsible. The officer made a report and told me to call again if anything else happens. He also told me that someone would call me the following day if there are any developments. I barely slept that night and must have checked the locks on everything 3 different times. Eventually, exhaustion caught up to me, and luckily I slept, even if it was just for a few hours. The following day, I waited around with my phone next to me, anticipating a call from the police. I assumed that with the new knowledge that John was in the immediate area, they must have set up a perimeter and finally found him. By the time 1 p.m. came, I got impatient and called the police station myself. I was hoping they had just forgotten to call me and update me on what was going on. After waiting on hold, I was finally put in contact with the officer that had been handling the case locally. I asked him if they had finally caught up with John, and his response was worse than I could have ever imagined. "Well, Mark," he said, "we've been looking into his whereabouts for a while now. Like I mentioned before, due to the severity of this case, other agencies have been involved in working on this case. Certain intelligence from one of the agencies is telling us that John ended up fleeing the country. We're not sure exactly where he's at now, but as far as we've been able to trace, it looks like he's headed to somewhere he can hide out at and not be extradited. So as far as he goes, you're safe. You don't need to worry about him anymore. And if he ever returns, which is doubtful, we will know about it. You can always call us if you ever feel you're in danger, but you don't need to worry about him anymore. He's been gone for a while, so that wasn't him. You're safe." I was absolutely shocked when he told me this. I knew what I saw the night before, and I tried telling him that their so-called intelligence had gotten this wrong, but he kept assuring me they hadn't. I could eventually begin to tell that he was patronizing me and treating me like I was just some paranoid crazy person, and that's when I lost hope. Yes, my mental illness is real and documented, but it's also being treated and has been for a while. It's even part of my probation deal that I don't walk around delusional anymore. I hung up the phone and knew right at that moment I was on my own. I explained the conversation I had with the officer to Eddie, and he once again became hopeful. Maybe it was just a random person and John actually was gone, he suggested. But I told him that wasn't the case. I saw John, and I was positive it was him. I don't know whether or not Eddie truly believed me, but he at least decided he would entertain the idea and act like he did. I was even more on edge about the situation at this point. I felt like John was going to come strike at us again at any moment, and I no longer had the reassurance that the police would take me serious and help me if I called them. I had to do this on my own, and that scared me. Eddie started talking to me about what type of plan we could come up with, but I told him I wanted him to stay out of it. I didn't want him getting hurt again because of me. He continued to insist that I let him help. I knew he was worried for me like I was for him, but he still wasn't even fully recovered from the last time he encountered John. I was trying to develop a rational plan. More than anything, I just wanted to move far, far away. The only way I would actually be able to do that would require selling my house first, and although it could be done, it wouldn't happen fast enough. Eddie and I decided to stay at a hotel the next couple nights while I figured out a more long-term plan. This of course wasn't the cheapest option and wasn't something we could do for long, but it at least gave me a small amount of peace for the time being and allowed me to finally sleep. Our second night at the hotel, I had to go to work, and Eddie had planned to stop back at our house to grab a few items we were going to need. The night went fine for me, but once I was done at work, I checked my phone and saw that I had a voicemail from a phone number I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold when I heard the voice of a nurse from our local hospital, letting me know Eddie was there and asking me to call them back. In a panic, I got in my car and began racing to the hospital as I tried calling back the number. I got bounced around a bit on the phone, and eventually I was able to speak with the nurse that had called me a bit earlier. She told me that Eddie was being treated for non-life-threatening injuries, but that I needed to get to the hospital as soon as possible. I attempted to gather more information, but she insisted that I would be filled in on everything once I arrived. Minutes later, I made it to the ER, where I was directed to Eddie's room. When I walked in, Eddie was lying in the bed as the nurse changed the dressing for his wounds. Obviously frantic and wanting to know what was going on, Eddie explained it to me. Earlier in the night, he went back to our house as planned. As he was walking up the stairs to our door, he tripped over a wire. This wire turned out to be attached to a shotgun, and tripping over the wire made it fire. Luckily for Eddie, the wire also tripped him and made him fall down. Therefore, he was only grazed on his shoulder and upper arm. Still, a decent amount of damage was done, but nothing at all life-threatening. I would like to say I was shocked when I heard this, but I wasn't. I was expecting something like this to happen. I was expecting it enough to get us a room for the time being. I knew in my heart two things. John was still in the area, and he was going to keep coming at me until one of us were dead. The police had already visited Eddie in the hospital before I arrived, but as the homeowner, they requested that I stop by the station to provide a statement. I left the hospital to go to the police station, telling Eddie to call me once he was discharged later in the night. On the drive there, I was stuck in this awful feeling of guilt for Eddie, who was now in even more pain on my behalf. If nothing else, I needed to at least keep him safe for now on. I thought that maybe it would be best if he wasn't around me until all this was resolved. If nothing else, I was holding on to a bit of hope that some good could come out of what happened tonight. Maybe the police would begin to take my theory on this more seriously. Upon arriving at the station, I was brought back so I could sit down with an officer. He asked me some general questions, and I explained to him that I knew for sure it was John that was after me, and Eddie was just unlucky. But as soon as I brought John up again, any hope I had was shattered. I was once again met with a reply that John had left the country. The officer told me they would continue to look into this, and overall, this further proved I was truly on my own. On the drive back to the hospital to get Eddie, I couldn't help but think the police weren't being honest with me. At one point, John was an extremely successful and wealthy man, and he had friends in high places. As of now, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a level of corruption going on. I knew there was still people holding a bias against me in this town. I was the crazy guy that killed the perfect, successful model student, at least in their eyes. Eddie was waiting for me by the time I made it back to the hospital. On the drive back to our room, I could tell he was doing his best to stay positive about everything, but I knew he was scared. Eddie went to bed as soon as we got back, and once I received a call from the police letting me know they checked my property out and it was clear, I decided I would go get the things that Eddie and I needed. Although I was tired, I figured it would be the best time to go. The drive there wasn't a long one, as we were staying pretty close by, but I began getting a bad feeling once I was nearing my property. I didn't see or hear anyone, but something just felt off. I tried telling myself it was just paranoia from what has been going on, but I was unable to shake the feeling. I turned my headlights off as soon as I turned onto my street and parked a bit down the road so I could approach my house safely and undetected. There wasn't much I had to carry back to my car anyway. I walked down the street as quietly as possible and crept through the yards to eliminate footsteps. I figured I was probably just being silly, but after everything that has happened, I didn't want to take any unnecessary risks. Upon reaching my property, I still didn't see anyone and began feeling more comfortable. But maybe 2 seconds later, I was stopped dead in my tracks. It was dark, but I saw a shadowy figure come around the corner of my house. I immediately got down and tried being quiet while I observed this individual. He was going around to every window, looking into each one for several seconds until moving on to the next. Once he neared the front of my house, enough light from the street illuminated him to the point where I could see it was John. I knew he was looking for me. Everyone knew that he completely melted down after his son died. It was obvious he's obsessed with the idea of killing me and doesn't care about anything else. I remained quiet, waiting to see what he was going to do next, but the silence was broken when my neighbor's dog began barking. I was about to panic. I continued watching John, and the dog appeared to scare him as much as it did me. He began looking around and slowly started backing away from my house. He headed through my backyard into the woods. I knew that this was my only chance to find out where he was staying. I maintained what I thought to be a safe distance and followed him into the woods. I made sure to be as quiet as possible, paying close attention to my surroundings so I didn't trip over anything or step on something that would create any unnecessary noise. After 10 minutes of this, I realized that my phone could give me away if someone called. Although I didn't expect anyone to get a hold of me at this time of night, I couldn't risk being killed over my cell phone. I briefly stopped walking and knelt down. I pulled out my phone and quickly put it on silent. Once I got back up, I found out that doing this nearly blinded me to the darkness around me. I tried regaining any night vision I could muster, but realized I had lost sight of John. I kept moving in the direction I last saw him heading, but was extra cautious. The last thing I wanted to do was accidentally walk past where John was at, completely exposing myself. I was shaking at this point. Every step I took felt like it was going to be my last. Finally, I heard some noise in the distance. I headed in that direction for a minute, until finally regaining sight of John. He was headed into what looked like an abandoned shack of some sort. I crept closer to get a better look, still maintaining a safe distance. It appeared he had made a few small renovations to the place, just to make it more inhabitable. I circled around the structure a bit, but wasn't able to get a look inside to see what he was doing. It didn't matter though. I managed to locate where he was staying, and could now bring an end to this nightmare. I spent the next 30 minutes navigating my way out of the woods and to my house, constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. I finally made it back to my property, and it looked like I was in the clear. I approached my house slowly, looking for any potential traps that might have been set up. Everything appeared to be clear, so I made my way inside and quickly grabbed what Eddie and I needed before heading back to our hotel room. When I arrived, Eddie was still asleep. Regardless of how exhausted I was, I knew I still needed to call the police to report John's location immediately. By the time I made the call, it was after 8 a.m., so I was able to be directed to the officer assigned to my case. "Hey Mark, how's everything going?" he asked after picking up the line. "Well, I have some good news," I said. "I went home to get a few things earlier this morning and found John on my property. I followed him about a mile into the woods and found out where he's been staying. I know where he's at. You guys can finally go pick him up." Hello? I was met with only silence for a few moments. "Mark," the officer finally replied, "we've been over this. Regardless of what you think you see or what you think is going on, it's not. John isn't here. He wasn't on your property earlier. He's not even in the country right now. I'm sympathetic to what you've been going through, but you can't keep using our resources here to go on a wild goose chase. I can't keep dropping what I'm doing every time you call just to repeat the same thing to you. I'm sorry, Mark, but you can't keep calling about someone that isn't even here. If you keep it up, you're going to end up in trouble. Just drop it, Mark. Do yourself a favor and drop it." I couldn't believe it. Even with hard proof available, they just won't pursue John no matter what. I could probably hand deliver him to the police station and they would still deny it's him. I hung up the phone without saying anything more. If the police weren't going to go after John, then I would. I couldn't allow Eddie and I to just sit around, waiting for John to attack us next. I didn't want to tell Eddie about all of this, as I didn't want him getting involved. But I also knew if I went after John, it might be the last time I even see Eddie, so I owed it to him to let him know what was going on. I gathered up the few supplies I could bring with me, a knife, pepper spray, a flashlight, etc. I figured if I could catch John off guard and hit him with a pepper spray, I could probably finish the job with a knife. Even with that being the best case scenario, I was fully aware of how much trouble I could get in. But with the reported attacks on Eddie, and the fact that John's a wanted murderer, I could surely come up with a solid defense. Either way, I felt like it was either this, or Eddie and I were going to end up dead. Once I told Eddie the plan I had in mind, he was less than happy about it. He spent some time trying to talk me out of it, and once that didn't work, he told me he was coming with me. Of course, I wasn't allowing that to happen. Once I explained my reasoning for everything, he seemed to understand. He still didn't like my idea, but he at least wasn't trying to stand in my way. Staying up all night was actually working in my favor. By the time I'd be going to sleep, I wouldn't wake up until around midnight. That way, I should be able to catch John off guard. With my nerves practically on fire and thoughts racing through my mind, falling asleep seemed almost impossible. But after enough time, exhaustion caught up and won. I woke up that night to an intense level of anxiety, like something had startled me awake. I looked around. It was mostly dark in our room, and I noticed that Eddie was asleep in his bed. Everything else was quiet. I then realized that it was a dream that had woke me up. I couldn't remember what the dream was actually about. I just had that sense that I could tell it happened. I checked the time and it was 11 p.m. This would give me some time to make sure I was completely ready and head over. I planned on parking at the same spot as the night before and making the trip on foot. I felt confident I could find where John was staying, even in the dark. There was a part of me that kept trying to talk myself out of going, but I just reminded myself that it was either this or waiting for John to kill me. I couldn't live with that constant fear, and I especially couldn't live with myself if I chickened out and Eddie died because of it. I planned on waiting until around 3 a.m. or so before heading over. I wanted the best chance possible of catching John while he was asleep. Once it was close for being time to leave, Eddie woke up. He again tried talking me out of going, but he quickly let up once I reassured him my mind was made up. He told me he wanted to come with me. At first, I again told him no, but he said he only wanted to stay at our house while I went. He said that way, he could eventually call the police if I didn't come back after so long. I made him promise he would stay in the house and keep the doors locked, and he did make that promise, along with reminding me he could barely lift one of his arms anyway, and he had no interest in hiking through the woods at night. "We leave in 10 minutes, I told him. He nodded and walked away to begin getting ready. The drive over to our house was both silent and tense. Eddie and I quietly walked up to our house. He pulled me in and gave me a hug. We looked at each other for a moment, and I was off. I followed the same path as last time to the best of my ability. It was much darker than I'd remembered. My progress was slow as I was trying to be as silent as possible and had a hard time seeing where I was going. I ended up walking, if you want to call it that, for a few hours and still hadn't managed to find John's shack. The sun began to rise, and although I was grateful for the light, I was also upset I would be arriving to my destination later than planned. These woods went on for miles, and if you walked far enough, it became easy to get lost. I slowed my progress down even more as the light began piercing through the trees. I was trying to get my bearings and figure out which way to head next. Moving as slowly as I did, it was difficult to estimate how far I walked, but I continued on anyway, and somehow, I eventually ended up seeing the shack in the distance. I checked my phone and it was nearly 10 a.m. at this point. I was hours off my goal, but I'd come this far and I wasn't backing down now. I slowly approached the structure. Once I was within 20 feet of it or so, I began to move only inches at a time. I couldn't hear any sound or movement coming from within the structure. I circled it a few times, trying to find a way to see anything inside, but there was no way to look in. I still heard nothing and hoped that John was asleep. I made my way to the door and opened it as quietly as possible, with my pepper spray in hand. It creaked quite a bit, so I decided to just throw it open as I launched my surprise attack. But it was empty. John wasn't here, and I began to wonder if this was just a temporary place he stayed for a night. Maybe I had no clue where he was after all. I began looking around the shack and quickly discovered it looked pretty well lived in. Based on the bed he put together and the food and hygiene items, someone was definitely living here. I started looking through his items, seeing if I could find anything that would lead me to any plans he had or his current whereabouts. I was moving fast and my heart was racing even just being here. I decided my best bet would be to hide out near the shack and wait for John to come back. I would launch my attack whenever that was and he wouldn't see it coming. I got my phone out to text Eddie. I'd been sending him text messages periodically, letting him know that I was fine. I tried sending him another one now, but I realized I no longer had service. It was okay though, I didn't need it. I had a plan, and I was going to wait as long as it took to execute it. I made my way back out of the shack, and then it felt like I was struck by lightning. The next thing I remember, I was struggling to get back to my feet. My ears were ringing, and I had a throbbing headache. I began to panic as I realized that this was no coincidence. John had caught me. As my vision began to clear, I looked up to see John above me. He had a smile on his face and was holding a bloodied baseball bat. It was at that point I could feel wetness running down my cheek and onto my neck. I was hit pretty hard, enough to cause bleeding, and I knew at that moment I blacked out for at least a second. Before I could get to my feet, John shoved me back to the ground. "Just stay down and don't make this harder on yourself," he said. He raised the baseball bat in the air as he prepared to swing it at me again. I managed to finally get my pepper spray out of my pocket and shot it in the direction of John's face. He screamed in pain, and I again began getting to my feet. I only made it a few steps before he grabbed the back of my collar and threw me to the ground. Just like his son, He was bigger and stronger than me, but I was going to fight, not only for my life, but for Eddie and Haley's as well. He began striking me in the back of the head with his fists. I was able to get up to one knee and quickly spun my body around, getting away from his grip. I ended up on my back and began kicking upwards towards his face as hard as I could. He dove towards me and I landed a hard kick to his jaw. He came down hard on top of me and knocked the wind out of me. I was praying he fell down unconscious, but I wasn't so lucky. I again tried squirming away, but I was pinned. He began hitting me over and over to the point I nearly passed out. Once he could tell I was pretty incapacitated, he finally got up. As I lied on the ground, he said, "I told you I could make this easy, but you didn't want that. It could have already been over for you. It's okay though, it's better this way. Do you remember this?" I looked up and John was holding a pocket knife in front of my face. It was my pocket knife, the one I used to kill his son that night. "Yeah," he continued, "I thought you would recognize it. A buddy of mine at the police station got it out of evidence for me. I wanted it because it was the perfect way to serve actual justice to you. Not that bullshit stay at the hospital that the judge thought was punishment. I'm going to put it right in your neck. An eye for an eye." "Then do it," I said. "Punish me for killing your son. Your stuck-up, undeserving, idiotic bully of a son. Even with a clear, lucid mind, there hasn't been a day I've ever regretted ending his pathetic life. And I'm sure I saved others the misfortune of ever meeting that prick. And apparently, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree after all. So, just do it." John began walking towards me slowly, with a knife in his hand. He had a new look of rage on his face. As he got to only a few feet from me, I closed my eyes, and I waited for it to be over. The next thing I knew, I heard a loud, metallic sound fill the air around me, and I felt a large mass falling on me. Again, it was John, but as I struggled to get out from underneath him, I realized he wasn't moving. I quickly looked up and saw a figure, holding the baseball bat that John had originally used to hit me with. Still being in a daze, I had to squint my eyes to make out who it was. My heart nearly stopped as I felt around for my injection site, making sure I was still properly medicated. "Ricky?" I said, barely getting the word out. "Mark," he replied. "Are you okay?" I was still struggling for words. This isn't real. What has really been going on in my life? Who are you?" "Mark, it's me," he said. I'm real. I'm actually real." "But how? Why?" I asked. Right at that moment, both of us directed our attention to John. He was beginning to breathe loud, gasping breaths. His head wound was obviously way more serious than mine, and then he appeared to stop breathing altogether. "Shit," Ricky said. "I didn't mean to kill him, but I couldn't let my twin brother die." "What? What do you mean, twin brother? What the hell does any of this mean?" "Mark, you can trust me. I'm real." "No," I said. "I can't trust you. That's what's wrong with me. I don't know what is real." Okay, he said. "Let me explain. I just met our dad, Eddie. Well, it was the first time I met him that I can actually remember. When we were born, Eddie was mentally ill. He thought I was the devil for some reason or something, and you were the pure one. Obviously that wasn't true, but in his mind it was. So he ended up trying to kill me a few times. My adoptive parents told me about this a few years back. Eventually, he tried drowning me in the bathtub when we were still just babies. He was locked up for that. Our biological mom divorced him and changed our last names. She was still concerned he would get out of prison and come for me, so she put me up for adoption. When our mom died, I found out about it. That's when I found out I had brothers too. And when I found out I had a fraternal twin, I had to find you. I tracked down the address and came to your house earlier this morning. Eddie was there, and when I introduced myself as your brother, he let me in and told me everything about what's been going on in both your lives since I was given away. And like I said, I wasn't going to let my twin brother die before I really even got to meet him. Eddie said you told him the shack was about a mile off your backyard. It wasn't too hard to find. I just stared at him in disbelief, continuing to check my injection site so I could verify for myself this wasn't just a delusion. My life changed in more ways than I could possibly imagine in just a second. Our mom covered up my existence the best she could. She didn't want you to be affected by all of this. Eddie was cut off too. He spent almost an hour telling me the story, but everything is okay now. He told me that the police were even doubting this guy was even in the country. Wait, this is the guy, right? Yeah, Ricky, it is, I replied. How did I know your name then? I asked. Ricky shrugged his shoulders. Probably ingrained from our mom saying it so much when we were babies. Plus, twins have a lot of weird twin stuff anyway, who knows? Ricky walked over a few steps and grabbed his phone off a fallen tree. He played with it for a second and then handed it to me. A video was playing, and it showed everything. It showed John coming after me with a knife, and Ricky saving me. Ricky said he did this to protect both of us, especially once he learned that I suspected corruption at the police department. Corruption that John himself seemed to verify. Ricky helped me through the woods and back to my house, as I was still quite a bit beat up. I was hospitalized for a night, and a police investigation was launched in regards to John's death. The police immediately began to accuse Ricky and I of conspiring together to kill John, but luckily Ricky's video quickly exonerated us. Eddie and I both fully recovered from our wounds, at least the physical ones. We're still medicated and living our lives, but things are good. We've been living together for a while now, and our friendship has never been stronger. I even met another girl, and things with her are great. Ricky lives a state over, but we still talk almost every day, and we see each other in person about once a month. There's been a lot of horror and trauma throughout my life, but when I go to sleep at night, I get to close my eyes and think back to that poor boy at school, and I get to smile knowing that Ricky and I have finally beaten the bully.